In the 20th century, Canadians won a deserved reputation for courage and endurance in battle.
Yet, of all the many instances of bravery against hopeless odds, few matched the courage of two regiments, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, in the Crown Colony of Hong Kong in December 1941. They faced a numerous, well-equipped enemy, who was not scared off, as some suggested. They had only light arms on their own side, yet not for a moment did they let down the proud traditions of the Canadian Army.
Posez, allez, en avant, allez, costume, allez, posez, allez, à la droite, allez, allez, posez, allez, hop, yeah, out, posez, allez, à la droite, numéro.
The Canadian Army has a long and proud history dating back to the Boer War and to the First World War, when hundreds of thousands of volunteers joined the army and went overseas to the cauldron of war which was the Western Front. As casualties mounted, recruiting posters in English and French evoked a continuing, generous response from young Canadians. As the war progressed through all its frightful events, Canadians remained firm to their resolve. By 1918, as the older countries of Europe had become exhausted by the struggle, more of a burden fell upon the younger countries, such as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, until the might of the United States backed the Allied cause. At the end of the war, the gratitude of their country and recognition of the services of the dead and also the living was expressed in this memorial, erected in Canada's capital, Ottawa. Few then would have thought that a half a world away, and a generation later, Canadians would again be called upon to sacrifice. The Crown Colony of Hong Kong was a trading hub of Asia. Goods and services were valued and exchanged as they had been for centuries. Perhaps many among the busy throngs could not conceive a time when their world would be overturned. Yet Asia in 1941 had become a perilous place. China itself, the world's most populous nation and among the largest, was riven by internal conflict and then by external attack. The view from Hong Kong was obscured by some ominous clouds. The Japanese had taken territory from China in the past, and in the 1930s sought to expand their positions. They had the largest, as well as the most efficient, army, navy and air forces in Asia, far larger than colonial forces. Only to the east of Japan, at the American naval base of Pearl Harbor, was there a force that they reckoned with. Total war between Japan and China erupted in 1937, when the Japanese rapidly took Shanghai, the capital at Nanking, as well as other substantial chunks of the territory up to 1939. In 1940, the Japanese also became involved in the French colonial possessions of Southeast Asia. It seemed only a matter of time before British possessions in Asia, particularly Hong Kong, would come under threat. Already there were refugees trickling into the Crown Colony with horrific stories to tell. Canada was already involved in a war on the other side of the world to Asia. As in World War I, young Canadians stepped forward to offer their services, and many had already gone overseas to support their country's cause. Their support was sorely needed in the British Isles. The equipment of an army, though not many of its personnel and little of its morale, had been left on the beaches of Dunkirk. Now there were new recruiting posters, and a spurt of enlistments across Canada, from the maritime provinces to Quebec to Ontario and to the wide provinces in the west. In January 1941, when the Imperial government under Winston Churchill revised defence arrangements in the Far East, they concluded that there would be no point in defending Hong Kong because it could be neither held nor relieved. Later in the year, Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham, the British Commander-in-Chief in the Far East, recommended, however, that extra troops should be sent to Hong Kong so that they could at least delay the Japanese assault. The Canadian government quickly offered troops. The reinforcements would consist of a headquarters group and 2 regiments, to be known as Sea Force. The troops selected were 2 regiments, the Royal Rifles of Canada, based on Quebec, and the Winnipeg Grenadiers from Manitoba. Neither of these regiments had experienced action, for the Royal Rifles had served in Newfoundland and New Brunswick, and the Winnipeg Grenadiers had been posted to Jamaica. Troops were carried to the Far East in the armed merchant cruiser Prince Robert. When the Canadians did arrive in Hong Kong on 16 November, their vehicles and heavy arms were elsewhere. Despite the lack of equipment, they promptly undertook more extensive training in the hills and gullies of Hong Kong and the mainland. Propaganda of the time portrayed the arrival of the Canadians as scaring off a little Japanese man in a flimsy boat. Only later would the absurdity of the propaganda be evident. The Empire of Japan was also gathering its armed forces for more assaults in the east and south, and against the trading centre of southern China. The tempo of war was heating up in Asia. In August 1941, the new commander of the Hong Kong garrison was Major General Christopher Maltby. He took vigorous efforts to improve the defences. When the Japanese attacked, he commanded, in addition to the 2 Canadian regiments, 2 British regiments, 2 Indian regiments, and a local volunteer defence corps, totalling in all about 14,000 men. Maltby's plan was to defend a defence line across the peninsula, a line soon nicknamed the Gin Drinkers Line. It was 13 kilometres long, with pillboxes and bunkers, but there were really too few soldiers to defend it, namely just 1 soldier every 5 metres. Hong Kong's air defences were limited to just 5 aircraft, all biplanes, namely 2 Walrus amphibians and 3 obsolete wildebeest torpedo planes. This photograph of Hong Kong's Kai Tak airfield just prior to the war reveals an airfield almost empty of aircraft. The colony's naval defence consisted of the old destroyer HMS Thracian, some gunboats, and a number of small motor torpedo boats. Virtually all these air and naval defences were quickly destroyed when the Japanese attacked.